Hello and welcome to the channel. I have the very exciting news that last week the British Airways staff did successfully negotiate themselves a quite significant pay rise. And negotiation nerds like me get very excited about this sort of news because it gives us something to talk about. There are not that many high profile negotiation events, and this is one. So my thanks go to those who comment on this channel, who brought my attention to the work of the unions, Unite in particular, and there will be lots to watch in this context, so there's more to follow, I think, because what they're doing is very interesting from a negotiation perspective. So before I continue on this one, a quick disclaimer, which is that I'm not myself involved in any of the union negotiation, especially not the British Airways one, and so I don't have any inside information. I can only go upon by what I have read in media reports. So if anything I say is factually incorrect, if anyone knows anything better, then absolutely please do comment below and put any corrections in there that you may have identified. So as the collaborative negotiator, I'm going to look at this with my negotiation hat on, and I'm just going to explain what has happened in a negotiation sense from using negotiation principles and terms. To start with, what we know is that British Airways staff are getting a quite significant sort of 8 to 13% sort of pay rise, which is pretty impressive actually. You rarely see those sorts of figures at these sorts of things. And of course, there was the threat of strike action, industrial dispute, and those got cancelled because British Airways agreed to their demands, or negotiations, shall we say. They compromised, no doubt. This is a successful negotiation. Remember what I always talk about with negotiations. You're not there to reach agreement. You're not there to... Your goal is not to have industrial action. Your goal is to achieve an outcome. And in this particular outcome, it was a significant pay rise. So in terms of the how to achieve those sorts of goals, one of the most important elements of any negotiation is empowerment. As I've said before on this channel, as an individual trying to negotiate with an employer, you have very little power. Sure, if you have very specialist skills, there are very few of you, you may be able to have a more direct local negotiation, shall we say, with your manager. But outside of that, and quite often in big organisations such as British Airways, they tend to have pay scales, pay bands and so on. So what that means is even if you are genuinely a scarce, high-skilled individuals, because you fit into a box and everybody in that box is paid the same or a similar rate, this very significantly limits your ability to negotiate. This is perhaps one of the downsides to union negotiation. You can end up with everybody being in the same. Of course, that means everyone being treated equally, but some people are more equal than others, shall we say. So that is perhaps the downside of union negotiation. On the more plus side, when you empower a union to negotiate on your behalf because you have banded together with a large number of other employees, then what you do is you empower those union representatives to drive a better deal for everybody. So perhaps individually you might score better if your manager is more amenable, but collectively and over the long term, what that should mean is, if the union is doing their job properly, that they protect you from degradation of your rights and your benefits, but also a more consistent, albeit perhaps not as high, overall pay rise return. So in this particular case, two unions represented quite a large number of BA staff. I'm not sure what the exact number is, but I do know that they were quoting as saying that they had 75% backing of those staff. Now that is a significant figure, and that again is important for the purpose of empowerment. It is much easier to be a union negotiator, to stand in front of the BA management and to say 75% of my staff, or the staff that I represent, intend to go on strike action unless you improve the offer. So that's quite a significant groundswell of feeling, shall we say. That has a momentum all of its own. So that no doubt would have been something that the union negotiators would have highlighted quite prominently in their negotiation with British Airways. There's also another element to this that empowers them, perhaps something people may have not looked at, which is that one of the big things, this is why there's a bit of this ambiguity about whether it's 8% or 13%, is because the unions were actually undoing a pay cut that was imposed by BA during the pandemic. Now, fair enough, during lockdown, the aviation industry was in crisis, so the company did what the company felt was necessary. But of course, that is not sustainable. So as a negotiator, if you are turning up and saying there is an injustice about to occur, and I would like to talk about remedying that, then that gives you quite a lot of empowerment. It gives you the moral high ground, because it's very hard for the BA, British Airways negotiators, to counter-argue against that. Arguing to keep people unfairly suppressed, shall we say, it's not exactly a winning argument. So that would have empowered BA, and they could have leveraged that not only to reverse those cuts, but also to say, and by the way, because they've suffered those cuts for the last 1 or 2 years, they need to have compensation now. That compensation now is an 8% pay rise, as fast as it's able to be delivered. So again, using their moral high ground, push for further concessions. That is a tactic I am sure that they adopted. And of course, the big one, the obvious one, cost of living crisis. We've got massive inflation, everyone's feeling the pinch, and again, this strengthened the argument for any union that wishes to negotiate with an employer. That is the strongest argument that all unions have right now, and again, it's a difficult counter-argument. You can't pretend that inflation doesn't exist and that people aren't suffering cost of living crisis, or you can argue as an employer is that increases in costs will have a detrimental impact on the business. But I will come back to that point in a bit. So, moving on from empowerment, let's talk about the threat. Now, in negotiation terms, I always caution people about being very cautious of using threats. Threats are something that have to be measured, they have to be credible, and they have to be, something that the other side takes seriously. So if you make a threat, you absolutely have to carry it out. And you shouldn't lead with a threat. That's a very bad practice in negotiation. You should always lead with, we want to reach an amicable solution. The threat is quietly there until it really has to become more prominent in the discussions, if those discussions are not proceeding well. So that is how one should negotiate when using a threat. In terms of the threat itself, this is obvious and big when it comes to union. You hold a ballot, your members vote to take industrial action, you then declare strike for a number of days with a certain level of severity, and you try to do that in order to leverage a stronger negotiation position. That is obviously what the union did here. However, they were a bit smarter than that. So what they did do is they also targeted peak season for the aviation industry. Summer holidays, people are going to go away. Now this is risky, and this is the thing with any threat, it is always risky. But it's risky to both sides. So the union's taking a risk in that the public can get really angry with them, but British Airways are also taking a huge risk that the public can get angry with them, and they will take a massive hit to the bottom line. They will suffer financially significantly. So choosing this particular time to call for industrial action applied a significant amount of pressure on the BA management, and that was deliberate by the unions to maximise their power and negotiation position. And this is assisted by the fact that, unlike other industries, aviation cannot just grab new staff or agency staff in volume to fill during strike action, because of course people working in airports need to be security checked. So this barrier to entry again is very beneficial for staff working in those kinds of industries who want to take industrial action. And this is the thing that people need to remember, that industrial action is not particularly effective if you are not targeted about where and when you do it. So the union knew that BA would have very little to practically counter the industrial action as long as it was all done legally, because they couldn't do a P&O and just turn up with loads of replacement staff. It just wasn't possible. So that made their threat credible. And then we get to the smartest thing that I believe Unite in particular did do. And Unite is headed up by a lady called Sharon Graham. She was elected last year to head up the union. And it's very interesting reading what she has done. And my thanks again to the commentators who drew my attention to this, because she created an economics analysis unit within the Unite union. And they have forensic accountants and so on. The job of that unit is to analyse the industry and the health of the company that has been targeted for industrial action. And Sharon Graham very openly stated that she was targeting British Airways as a successful action, and that one of the things that the unit had identified was that Heathrow was the most lucrative money spinner for British Airways. So when the union decided that they were going to do industrial action and got the agreement of the staff to do so, they picked the time to cause the maximum amount of damage to the airline, but they also picked the most profitable bit of the airline during that peak time. And notice this wasn't a nationwide or widespread industrial action. This was very specifically targeted check-in and baggage staff at Heathrow, because that is where the money is, and that is where the strike action would have the maximum damage to the airline. So what that did was apply significant leverage to British Airways. So take the empowerment and the fact that they had the moral high ground in terms of negotiating. They've also got a very credible and very damaging threat that they can apply in their negotiations, and obviously they did so successfully. Now I do have a query at the end of this, whether there's other leverage, because the Unite Union under Sharon Graham is not above looking outside of the direct issue. And I've talked about this in previous negotiation videos. When you're struggling for leverage on the issue that you're trying to negotiate with, then one of the ways around that is to find something not relevant to the negotiation, but that you can influence in a way to apply pressure. So in the case of the Unite Union, I'm aware that when they were negotiating with a bus company, they actually applied pressure by speaking to union members in a completely different country, where that bus company is trying to win a bid. And they told the politicians and union members in that other country, I'm not going to name which one it is, but you can look it up for yourself if you're really interested, what that company had done in the UK. And that made that company at high risk of failing to win a very lucrative bid. Immediately, that company then signed an agreement with the Unite Union to remedy the previous action that they had taken. So what the union did is they went completely outside the issues of what had been discussed at the negotiation and found other leverage. Now, I do not know if Unite and GMB Union did this with British Airways, but if they did, I would be really interested in finding out. And it is possible that they did so, because that is how Unite Union smartly and currently operates on behalf of its members. So, my final concluding thoughts to this, look at some of the wide implications of what this actually means. And there's actually, I've talked about just the BA staff one because that was the one that was reported in the news quite prominently, but there are quite a few other industrial actions that got called off. And this is because a whole host of issues got resolved through negotiations, but with various unions and various airlines. I'm not going to cover all of that. What I'm going to think about here is asking questions. In the current climate, it would now appear to be an extremely bad time to be an employer that wants to reduce the rights or the pay of your employees. In no small measure, this is because of the cost of living crisis, the moral high ground, but also because the UK is currently in a very stressed labour market. So the counter threat that employers would normally use is, well, we can just replace the staff easily. That counter threat cannot really be used in the current market. There are severe shortages, labour shortages everywhere. So those employers know that they have to keep their current employees sweet and working for them. That means they have to pay more, they have to retain them, because to do so it would be extremely damaging. And the union know this. So right now, any employer trying to reduce pay is probably in for a pretty rough hiding, unless there's some particular circumstances that strengthen their hand. The next question I particularly want to ask is whether the unions actually now have the power to wreck companies. Because if they're being smart and they're targeting the bottom line for those companies, as Unite and GMB did with British Airways, they may only go on strike for a few days. And this has always been the weakness of industrial action in the past. It is a blunt tool, and employers would just take the hit and then carry on business as usual, and then just do a bit of a PR blitz to make the union look bad in the press. Now, they can of course still try and do that sort of thing, but if the unions are targeting their most profitable days and their most profitable locations, business units, whatever it may be, then even the loss of 1 or 2 days and the extra cost that results, or the disruption that tend to carry on after industrial action, that could potentially be so ruinous that the company will not return to profitability that year. So now, this is always the case with industrial action. You have to remember that those striking take a pay hit. They don't get paid for that day they're on striking, and that's one of the weapons that employers do have that can help them reduce the cost a bit. But if they're getting absolutely hammered by other costs, planes still cost money, even if you're not flying them, for example. If you have building with rent or leasehold or whatever, that still has to be paid, even if you're not fully utilising them. So if companies are having to incur those massive costs, and if they keep refusing to agree to negotiate successfully with the unions, then that's going to be very damaging for the companies. Will it bring them down totally? Unlikely, as a rule, but perhaps not impossible if the industrial action goes on for long enough and hits them hard enough. And right now, particularly the aviation industry, where things are really difficult because of all the things that have happened for the last 2 years, they're too weak, too vulnerable to even take short-term impacts right now. So if those industrial actions go on for too long, it can destroy the company and it can destroy the senior management of the company. They would basically be fired for incurring such horrible losses. So what does this also mean, particularly this BA strike action? Because industrial action avoided is even better than actually having to conduct an industrial action itself. So deployment of a threat that you never have to use is far better than actually carrying out the threat, I suppose is another way of putting it. So the fact that the unions have been able to reach resolution of the issue through negotiation without resorting to industrial action, and as long as that stays, everyone stays loyal to the agreement, shall we say, then that will incentivize, that would tell other companies who are also facing the threat of industrial action that the unions are very happy to reach agreement with them and to stick with them. They'll make it hurt if they have to, but they're more than happy not to carry out that threat. And that is important, because good faith and trust that the other side will keep their word is important in any negotiation. So I'm going to chalk this up as a really big win for the unions, because they didn't actually go on strike, but they did successfully negotiate a good outcome that even British Airways press office could only say was excellent news, and they were very happy with the positive response, which is it's the only thing they could say. So I hope you found this little example interesting. I think there's going to be lots more of it, and I will be keeping my eyes open to see how the other industrial actions and other activities conducted by the union going, particularly those on negotiations. And as always, if you enjoy this, please do like and subscribe, and please do comment below if you have any views or any particular insights that are worth sharing. Thank you.